The Linguaverse episode 14 Language and Reality. Welcome back to the Linguaverse. If you've been with me so far, you'll know what to expect. We don't do sound bites here. We sit with words slowly, follow them where they go, through history into bodies across screens, and sometimes into the places where words fail. Arc 2 has been a slow widening of view. First, we stepped into the uncanny territory of words produced without breath in AI and synthetic speech. Then we traced how English itself became a global sponge in the evolution of language. We explored where language breaks down in the ineffable. We asked whether language shapes the mind in language and consciousness. We examined how language shapes the individual in the linguistic self. Now we step outward again. If the previous episode asked, "Who am I?" this one asks, "What is the world I live in?" More precisely, what part of that world is language? And to what degree does language simply describe reality? And to what degree does it make it? This question is both ancient and urgent. People have always used words to name gods, plot borders, make promises, and bind communities. In myth, the world is spoken into being. Genesis opens with a speech, "Let there be light." In many traditions, naming is an act of creation. Even outside theology, legal orders are held together by words, constitutions, titles, contracts. The currency itself, the money in our pockets, is at its base, a shared story given form by language. That's the tension. Words can reflect something already present, or they can be constitutive. They can create the thing they purport to describe. And the answer matters because if language helps build reality, then changing language changes the world. I don't arrive at this question as a detached theorist. My work, the Inversiverse, the unfiltered human on the fringe, the body knows, my inner child was broken, has been about tracing how language shapes perception, emotion, and social arrangements. Those projects are theoretical and practical both. They come from research, from lived experience, from professional development, and from a willingness to be changed by the silence and the work. When I embraced stillness, when I did the inner work, my sense of what was possible altered. Words I once swallowed whole no longer fit. Naming what I'd felt suddenly made tangible patterns I'd once thought private. Understanding allowed implementation, and implementation changed how my inner world showed up in the outer world. That personal arc is why I care about this subject. Language is not merely communication. It is a technology of reality. This episode will move between three registers: philosophy and history, the theories that help us think clearly, lived examples, how language builds institutions and daily life, and practical sense, what we can do with this knowledge. I'll bring in thinkers you may know. Wittgenstein's famous note that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world is a starting point, but we'll go further. We'll look at the social construction of reality, at Korzybski's reminder that maps are not the territory, at Foucauldian regimes of truth, and at how words become performative, not simply descriptive. My aim is simple: to show you in both sweeping arcs and near-field examples how language and reality are braided. If words make worlds, we have responsibilities in how we speak. If words only describe, then we can be more experimental with them. Either way, understanding the mechanism gives us leverage. So let's begin where all making begins, with a name. Words as world makers' language can be a mirror. It can also be a hammer. It can also be both at once. When we say word as world maker, we mean something specific. Naming something often changes how it exists. Naming can erect institutions, stabilize agreements, and create categories that then have causal effects. A marriage certificate brings into being a legal status that reorganizes rights and resources. A currency note, backed only by collective trust, becomes a medium of exchange that structures labor and value. A company, given corporate personhood, can own property, sue, be sued, and persist across generations in ways that change landscapes and lives. In short, language doesn't just talk about the world, it helps fabricate parts of it. Naming and creation myths and institutions across cultures, myths teach this lesson plainly. The Hebrew creation story, the Vedic hymns, and many indigenous creation accounts. Speech is creative. Naming is binding. In myth, the act of naming is not passive. It is an intervention. The first human words discipline chaos into cosmos. That mythic intuition survives in secular institutions. When a tribe agrees on a name for a leader, that leader accrues authority. When a legislature passes a law, it changes incentives and practices. Let's take a small ordinary example, the label refugee. To be given that label under international law is to cross a threshold. The named person acquires rights, protections, and forms of recognition they lacked before the name was applied. The word does something. It changes legal standing, access to services, even the tone of public sympathy. Conversely, refusing to name people as refugees, or instead calling them migrants or illegals, creates different realities, different policies, different moral atmospheres, and different outcomes. If you write as I have, you see this across systems. In the Inversiverse, I mapped how frames and labels structure perception, how political systems, marketing networks, and institutional grammars give rise to staged realities. Language mediates power and possibility. It doesn't merely report the world, it helps forge the livers that alter it. The performative force of language. This idea is formalized in modern philosophy of language by J. L. Austin and later theorists. Some utterances are constative, they describe, while others are performative, they do. Austin's classic example. When an officiant says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the sentence itself affects the change. Before the words, legally, the couple were unmarried. After the declarative utterance, they aren't. The speech act performs the social transformation. The example scales up. Consider "I promise." That short sentence initiates obligations, changes expectations, and can be audited. "I resign" terminates a role. "We will go to war" is performative at the national scale. Even the phrase "this is money" expresses a collective decision that has enormous consequences. Fiat currency works because we agree it will. The central bank issues the phrase, and institutions, markets, and millions of citizens comply with the truth of that phrase. When language is understood this way, as tools that coordinate human systems, we can see how fragile and how powerful human reality is. The social world is built on mutual recognition, on the repeated actions, rituals, and scripted speech that create and maintain structures. Social construction versus ontological claim. A common misread of the social constructionist stance is to say that if something is socially constructed, it isn't real. That's not the claim. The claim is subtler. Many features of our world are real because of shared practices and linguistic agreements. Marriage, money, corporations states they are not atoms in the ground, but their effects are tangible. Material resources are distributed, people are bound to obligations, and laws are enforced. Socially constructed realities are very real in consequence. Think of law. There's no physical property in a deed beyond ink and paper, but property lines endure and produce concrete consequences. Fences, mortgages, exclusion. You can bulldoze a property, but institutions will step in with court orders and police. The paper and the signatories, the language-bound documents, create institutionally enforceable facts. Language matters because power circulates through it. Naming, categories, and lived experience. Beyond institutions, everyday categorization shapes inner life. When medicine affixes a diagnostic word, depression, autism, bipolar, whole trajectories of care, stigma, identity, and agency can follow. Diagnosis can bring relief. Finally, a framework that helps someone make sense of recurrent experiences. Diagnosis can also narrow possibilities. Now one's experiences are read through a medical lens that attributes causality to brain chemistry and sometimes obscures socioeconomic, nutritional, or relational causes. This is why language reforms, the careful, contested renaming of things, matter so much politically and experientially. Calling something addiction rather than moral failure, or survivor rather than victim, shifts both policy and interior life. Names can become tools of emancipation or instruments of control. You see these dynamics in my own work. My inner child was broken gave language to wounds that often go unnamed. Naming them changed how people could approach healing. The body knows argues that the body holds memory, and that naming sensations can provide a bridge back to what the nervous system experienced. When we translate embodied experience into words, we create a pathway to integration. That is language as world-making inside the nervous system itself. Language and technology. Creating virtual realities, language is equally constitutive in digital spaces. The tags we assign to a photo, the metadata attached to a file, the labels added to a dataset, all these shape what machines will do, and therefore what users will perceive. Algorithms classify, rank, and surface content according to the language fed into them. An image labeled as protest will be processed differently from one labeled as street party. The linguistic frames we give to data shape the virtual worlds that algorithms create. The point extends to naming in software. Call something a bug, and it goes into the backlog. Call it a feature, and it may be preserved. Words orient technical practice. Rituals, repetition, and fixation names bind most effectively when repeated. Rituals, from court oaths to daily mantras, stabilize the reality they invoke. Consider the daily repetition of the market close price. The number is meaningless except insofar as traders and institutions use it to set expectations. But over time, these ritual facts become anchors around which economic life arranges itself. Investments, pensions, debt, retirement plans. Naming plus repetition produces habit, and habits become institutions. Habitualized language shapes what we notice and what we ignore. Over the years, the world we inhabit ossifies into a set of affordances, things you can easily do, and things you are tacitly prevented from doing by linguistic conventions. If you are trying to change a social reality, say, to shift public conversation about mental health, you don't merely offer a new fact. You design rituals, conventions, and repeated frames that help the new description roll into practice. Changing a label is the start. Repetition, pedagogy, and ritual are what build a durable new reality. Cases in point, how words shifted material worlds. Let's look at some concrete historical examples. 1. Slavery and emancipation. The legal creation and dissolution of slavery hinged on language. Slavery as an institution was maintained by law, contract, and religious framing. Abolition required new words, freedom, emancipation, backed by legislation. Once read into law, those new linguistic categories began to reorganize property relationships, labor markets, and moral orders, even while material struggles continued. 2. Corporate personhood. The phrase corporate personhood is a legal fiction, a linguistic and juridical device that grants certain rights to an organization, but once the language is entrenched, corporations can hold property, sue, and influence politics. That linguistic fiction produces material outcomes, concentration of resources, political lobbying, and environmental consequences. 3. Fiat money. Historically, money had been tied to gold or other commodity standards. Modern fiat systems rest on shared belief expressed and reinforced through language, legal tender laws, central bank pronouncements, and market narratives. The repeated linguistic acts of trusting the currency generate the circle of confidence that keeps it functioning. Destroy that trust, language cracks, and value evaporates. 4. Health language. The classification of diseases in manuals like the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, draws boundaries that determine insurance payments, disability accommodations, educational provisions, and social stigma. When a behavior is medicalized, it enters an apparatus of care that is simultaneously liberatory and constraining. Each of these cases shows that naming is not passive, it is a technology. Language organizes practice, allocates resources, and shapes possibilities. The ethics of naming: if words make worlds, then who names matters. Naming is an exercise of power. Powerful actors, state institutions, universities, corporations, and media conglomerates often impose the categories that stick. Those categories reflect interests and assumptions. That's why we study the process of naming as political work. There is an ethics to naming. Who gets to name, and in whose interest? Historically marginalized groups often had their names, and thus their realities, determined by others. Reclaiming language is an explicit political act. Terms like black, disabled, or queer were once pejorative or medicalized. They have been reclaimed and repurposed as identity, dignity, and political claim-making. That shift is itself world-making. The ethical questions multiply when naming is global. English language frames, often backed by institutions in the West, travel across different cultural ecologies and can overwrite local knowledges. A syndrome named in a Western diagnostic manual can become the dominant frame worldwide by linguistic and institutional force, sometimes erasing indigenous, alternative ways of understanding suffering and resilience. Part of responsible practice is the humility to ask, does this name honor the people it describes? Does it open resources and agency, or does it close off other possibilities? Does it replicate the patterns of domination I claim to oppose? Language, embodiment, and inner realities. So far, I've emphasized social institutions and macro effects, but language also makes worlds inside bodies. When we name an emotion, it ceases to be amorphous and becomes legible to the nervous system. Labeling an experience as fear or grief gives the body a frame for response, for breath practices, for cognitive reappraisal, and for social support. That is partly why talk therapy can be effective. Translating sensation into language changes the body's orientation to experience. The body knows is about precisely this pivot. Language mediates the translation between felt experience and narrative sense-making. When you put words to a sensation, my throat tightens when I enter loud rooms, you create an opening for action. The naming itself organizes attention. This is not magical, it is practical. Language structures perception, and therefore shapes the range of possible actions. Limits and dangers. When words harden reality in the wrong ways, now the darker side. If language can enable, it can also constrain, weaponize, and erase. When words are used to hide, obfuscate, or redirect attention, they generate harmful realities. Misdirecting frames can trivialize experience, not a pandemic, just a seasonal flu, when data suggests otherwise, or they can pathologize dissent, terrorist versus freedom fighter. The choice of frame is political. Words can also produce systems of classification that become cages. Consider the political uses of national security, extremist, illegal, or terrorist. Each label sets a legal and moral frame that authorizes surveillance, detention, or exclusion. Once the label is accepted, the associated practices follow, often without proportional scrutiny. Similarly, language can erase. Colonial naming practices frequently renamed places and people, stripping them of indigenous identities and histories. That erasure has shaped built environments and resource access for centuries. These abuses remind us that naming requires ethical and political vigilance. It is not enough to recognize that words make worlds. We must ask whose worlds and to what ends. Practical reflection. Mapping 5 realities created by words. Before we move on in the episode, a short exercise. Take 5 everyday realities that exist because of language. Here are some prompts to guide you choose a social institution: marriage, corporation, nation state. Name the key linguistic acts that sustain it. Choose an economic artifact, currency, stock market. Note the linguistic conventions, announcements, laws, and accounting categories that make it work. Choose a personal identity term, diagnosis, role. Reflect on how being named reorganized your life. Choose a technological classification, spam, algorithmic tag. Notice how that label changes outcomes. Choose a legal designation, refugee, citizen, criminal. Consider the rights and limits the word produces. Write these down. For each, ask what change in action occurred when the name was applied. What resources that didn't exist before are now routinized by that naming practice? Reflection prompt microjournaling, 10 to 15 minutes. Take the 5 items you named. For each, write one short paragraph, 3 to 5 lines, answering, how did language make this thing happen? What would be different if it didn't have that name? Be concrete. What changed in people's behavior, in institutions, in resource allocation? Practical activity, name to map, 30 to 40 minutes. Goal, make visible how a single name organizes practice and reality. Materials, paper or digital doc, a pen, 30 to 40 minutes. Steps 1. Pick one named reality from the 5 you journaled, e.g., refugee, company, currency, diagnosis. 2. Draw a simple map. Put that name in the center and draw spokes to the actions and resources it creates, laws, social benefits, surveillance, money flows, clinics, stigma, etc. 3. For each spoke, note who benefits and who loses power resources. 4. Then imagine a renaming. What if the label were different, e.g., displaced persons versus illegal migrants? Sketch a second map showing altered actions and resources. 5. Write a single sentence policy recommendation or personal action you could take that flows from the renaming, e.g., use forced displacement in my reporting to highlight structural causes, or advocate for paperwork support for those labeled X. Reflection questions. Who gets to name in this field now and why? Which institutions would have to change to support a different name? Which communities would be empowered by renaming, and which might lose privileges? Language as world-making is not an abstract slogan. From the very small, a parent naming a child, to the very large states issuing decrees, names rearrange what is possible. Names can heal, liberate, and organize. They can also marginalize, ossify, and conceal. Understanding this dual nature is the first step toward acting ethically. Naming with care, contesting harmful frames, and deliberately shaping the rituals through which new realities become lived facts. We will now explore a complementary danger, confusing the map for the territory. We'll look at how descriptions harden into truths and why that error produces both intellectual and practical harms. The map and the territory language is a double-edged tool. On one side, it builds worlds, as we explored in the previous part. On the other hand, it risks deceiving us, making us confuse the representation with the thing it represents. This is the tension Alfred Korzybski captured in his famous phrase, "The map is not the territory." That simple sentence has become a kind of mantra in both philosophy and systems thinking. It reminds us that words, diagrams, concepts, and maps are simplifications. They help us navigate, but they are not identical to the terrain itself. The danger arises when we forget this distinction and begin to treat the map as if it were the territory. Why we love maps and why we forget they're maps. Humans are meaning-making animals. The world is overwhelming in its raw data. Infinite sensory impressions, events unfolding at every scale, from the molecular to the cosmic. We need shortcuts. Language offers those shortcuts. It compresses reality into categories. Tree, dog, storm, justice. These words allow us to think and speak without drowning in detail. A map is necessary. Without it, we'd be paralyzed by complexity. But compression is distortion. A word like tree covers birches and oaks, saplings and sequoias, fruit trees and ornamentals. The single word erases difference. That's the trade-off, simplicity at the cost of nuance. Most of the time, this trade-off is acceptable. I can say, let's meet under the tree and you'll know where to find me. But at other times, collapsing diversity into a single term becomes misleading or even dangerous. When we say the economy is growing or crime is rising, we're using maps that erase complexity, local variations, distributional differences, or how crime is defined. The map isn't wrong, it's just partial. Forgetting that it's partial makes us mistake abstraction for reality. Korzybski and General Semantics. Korzybski, the Polish-American scholar who coined the map is not the territory, founded a field he called General Semantics. His point was not merely semantic nitpicking, it was existential. He argued that much human suffering comes from confusing symbols with what they represent. If I mistake my idea of a person for the person themselves, I risk miscommunication, projection, and violence. If I mistake an economic model for the real economy, I may design policies that ignore lived realities. General semantics encourages a discipline of checking. Always remind yourself that the word is not the thing. He used examples like this. Dog is not the dog. The word is a symbol. The animal is a living, breathing being. Food is not nutrition. Calling something food doesn't make it nourishing. Wealth is not the same as money. Numbers in an account may not reflect sustainable well-being. These seem obvious, but think about how often we collapse them. How often does someone argue about the economy as if GDP were identical with lived prosperity? How often do we confuse diagnosis with the person, treating them as an ADHD or a schizophrenic rather than a human being with complex dimensions? Each of these collapses the map and the territory, with consequences that ripple outwards, maps that trapped us. History's lessons history is littered with examples where mistaking maps for territories caused harm. 1. Colonial cartography. Colonial powers drew maps with straight lines across Africa and the Middle East. Those maps ignored tribal, cultural, and ecological boundaries. The lines were abstractions, conveniences for empires, but once enforced, they became real, shaping borders, fueling wars, and generating displacement. The map became the territory, and generations have lived with the fallout. 2. Racial categories. Racial classifications are linguistic maps imposed on human variation. The categories simplify complex genetic and cultural diversity into a handful of labels. Once institutionalized in law, census, or ideology, they became treated as biological realities. The consequences: slavery, segregation, apartheid, eugenics. The labels were never the territory, but treating them as if they were justified violence. 3. Economic models. The map of rational economic man. The idea that humans are always self-interested maximizers of utility has shaped decades of policy, but the model was never fully accurate. Humans are social, emotional, often altruistic, and sometimes irrational. Policies built on the abstraction have sometimes ignored lived realities, producing systems that fail to account for inequality, communal life, or psychological well-being. Each case shows the same pattern. Abstraction becomes reified, treated as fact. The map, once mistaken for the territory, begins to direct behavior in ways that distort or damage. Why the error persists? Why do humans keep making this mistake? Several reasons. Cognitive efficiency. It's easier to treat the map as reality. Nuance is exhausting. Abstractions simplify decision-making. Institutional power. Institutions benefit from stable categories. A census wants to count people. A legal system wants clear definitions, so it enforces maps even if messy realities don't fit. Psychological comfort. Certainty feels safe. Ambiguity is unsettling. A neat label, he's depressed, she's lazy, soothes us, even if it obscures the real complexity. Linguistic habit. Words are sticky. Once a term circulates, it gains inertia. People repeat it uncritically. The repetition hardens maps into apparent realities. Science. The art of better maps science itself can be understood as a map-making enterprise. Theories are maps, models are maps. They are tools, not truths. A good scientific map captures enough of reality to make predictions and guide action. But no map is total. Even physics reminds us of this. Newton's mechanics worked well at the human scale, but broke down at relativistic and quantum levels. The Newtonian map was never the whole territory. It was just sufficient for many purposes. The best scientists hold maps lightly. They know models are provisional, always subject to revision. Problems arise when maps are mistaken for final truths. Theories become dogmas. Alternative observations are suppressed. The humility of this is a map is lost. Personal experience. The map of mental health. In my own work, I've wrestled with maps of the self. Diagnostic categories such as autism, ADHD, and bipolar are linguistic maps. They point to patterns, clusters of traits, and tendencies. They can be useful, offering guidance, community, and support, but they are not the territory. The lived reality of each person is more complex than the label. When I was given diagnostic labels, I saw both sides. On one hand, a sense of clarity. Here was a framework that explained certain patterns in my life. On the other hand, a danger. The label risked shrinking me. People looked at me through the map rather than seeing the territory. You are autistic. You are bipolar. The word risked overriding the person. This is why I argue, again and again, that while labels can help, they are also cages. They are maps, and maps can trap us if we forget they are only approximations. The person always exceeds the label. Consciousness, creativity, pain, joy, none of it can be exhausted by a diagnostic phrase. Reality construction, maps as performative. Here's where the paradox sharpens. While maps are not the territory, once enough people treat them as if they were, they start to reshape the territory. Maps become self-fulfilling. Take intelligence testing. The IQ map was meant as a rough tool for identifying learning needs. But when societies began to treat IQ scores as truths about people, doors opened or closed. Access to education, employment, and social standing shifted. The map changed life trajectories, shaping the very territory it claimed only to describe. Or consider financial ratings. If a credit agency downgrades a country, investors pull out. The economy may spiral. The map rating triggers behavior that alters the territory economy. The feedback loop is complete. This is the danger and the power of language. Maps don't just describe. When taken seriously, they create. The key is to know when a map is useful and when it is distorting reality in ways that harm. Living with multiple maps. Another insight. There is no single map. Different maps highlight different features of the same territory. Think of London. The tube map shows connections but distorts geography. A street map shows distances but ignores train lines. A topographic map shows elevation but not cafes. Each map is partial, each useful for different purposes. Confusion arises when we expect one map to serve all needs. The same is true in life. The medical map highlights symptoms. The psychological map highlights stories. The sociological map highlights structures. The spiritual map highlights meaning. None alone is sufficient. Together, they give a fuller picture. But we must remember each is partial, each an abstraction. This recognition is liberating. It means we can move between maps flexibly, knowing they are tools, not prisons. We can ask which map serves me here, which one illuminates, and which one obscures. The practice of map awareness. How then do we cultivate awareness of maps without drowning in relativism? Some practices help. 1. Add for me or in this context. Instead of saying, this is depression, try, this looks like depression for me in this context. It reminds you that the label is a map, not the total truth. 2. Seek multiple maps. If you have only one frame, look for another. How would an economist, a poet, a therapist, and a biologist each map this issue? 3. Ask, what does this map leave out? Every map highlights some features and erases others. Actively ask what's invisible. 4. Watch for reification. When a concept becomes treated as a thing, the market demands pause. Who is being ventriloquized through that abstraction? 5. Return to the territory. Ground yourself in lived experience. Walk outside, touch, listen, feel. Ask, what is here beyond the label? Reflection and activity reflection prompt. Think of one map in your life you've been living by, a label, a model about yourself or the world. Ask, how has this map helped me navigate? And where has it limited me? What parts of the territory has it ignored? Practical activity. The map audit. Allow 30 minutes. 1. Write down 3 maps you use often. Examples: a diagnostic label, a political ideology, a professional role. 2. For each, list what it highlights, the parts of reality it clarifies. 3. Then list what it hides, the parts of reality it neglects. 4. Finally ask, what would change if I switched to a different map, or held 2 maps side by side? This audit is not about discarding maps, we need them. It's about holding them lightly, remembering they are tools, not truths. The map is not the territory, is more than a slogan. It is a way of moving through life with humility. Words, models, theories, diagnoses, they are maps. They can guide, they can mislead, they can even shape the terrain. But they are never identical with the fullness of reality. To live wisely is to honor maps without confusing them with the territory, to use words while remembering their limits. In the next part, we'll look at how shared maps become collective realities through slogans, memes, and cultural scripts, and how language shapes not just individual perception, but the consciousness of entire societies. Reality by consensus constructing reality together. When we speak of reality, most people assume we're pointing to something objective and solid, the ground beneath our feet, the sky above, the table between us. But sociologists Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckman unsettled this certainty in their classic 1966 book, The Social Construction of Reality. Their argument was deceptively simple. Much of what we call reality is not natural, inevitable, or given. It is constructed and built through social processes, sustained through shared language, and stabilized by collective belief. Reality, in other words, is often a consensus. Berger and Luckman used the term institutionalization to describe how repeated behaviors, once stabilized and named, become part of a social world. A ritual, a role, a law, once enough people agree on it and act as if it is real, it becomes real in practice. It feels objective, though its foundation is intersubjective. This doesn't mean there is no external world. Stones bruise, fire burns, storms destroy, regardless of belief. But when we look at social worlds, money, morality, law, religion, gender, politics, the terrain is built from words as much as from matter. The architecture of consensus realities depend on collective agreement, reinforced by language. Let's take a tour through some of the most influential builders of these realities. 1. Memes. Richard Dawkins coined the term meme in The Selfish Gene, 1976, to describe units of cultural transmission, jokes, songs, rituals, slogans that replicate like genes. In today's digital culture, memes are not just jokes with pictures, they are carriers of consensus. A meme like the Leonardo DiCaprio smug face conveys a shared reality. It says, we all recognize this dynamic, we are all in on the irony. To repost it is to affirm membership in that consensus. Memes compress whole worldviews into punchlines. They do not merely reflect consensus reality, they enforce it. 2. The media is a great amplifier of consensus. When a news channel repeats the economy is in crisis day after day, the phrase becomes a lived reality, even if one's daily life hasn't changed. Agenda-setting theory in media studies shows that media may not tell us what to think, but they powerfully influence what we think about. Language is the scaffold, headlines, soundbites, slogans. 3. Law is consensus written in stone. Theft is not real until a society agrees to define it and punish it. Marriage, property, and citizenship, all legal fictions, sustained by shared belief and enforced through institutions. Once codified, they feel solid, but they are linguistic at root. Contracts, statutes, constitutions. 4. Religions build entire cosmologies through language. Sacred texts, rituals, prayers, and doctrines organize reality for billions. The words sin, salvation, karma, or nirvana are not neutral descriptors. They frame existence itself. To grow up inside a religious worldview is to inhabit a consensus reality that feels as inevitable as gravity. Modern examples of consensus realities are not relics of history. They are alive in our daily lives. Let's look at 3 potent examples. 1. Fiat currency. Perhaps the clearest case of socially constructed reality is money. In a fiat system, currency is not backed by gold or any physical commodity. It has value because governments declare it legal tender and people accept it. A paper note in itself is meaningless. Burn it, and it provides less warmth than kindling. But in the social consensus, it is powerful. It buys bread, secures housing, and fuels economies. Collapse the consensus, and the note is just decorated paper. Hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, or Venezuela shows how fragile this reality is. Once collective trust evaporates, so does the reality of money. 2. Gender pronouns. Another current example is the debate around gender pronouns. For some, pronouns like they, them, or neopronouns like sie, zer reflect authentic identity and demand recognition. For others, they feel like linguistic innovations that challenge established consensus. What this debate reveals is that gender is not only biological but also linguistic, sustained by words, norms, and agreements. To change pronouns is to renegotiate reality itself. Berger and Luckman would see this as a classic case of reality under reconstruction. New patterns of speech, contested but gaining traction, slowly altering the social fabric. 3. Political truths politics thrives on manufactured consensus. Weapons of mass destruction. Make America great again. Take back control. These phrases do not merely describe, they conjure realities. To believe them is to enter a shared world, complete with enemies, hopes, and fears. Once enough people buy in, policies follow. Consensus here is volatile. Competing slogans fight to dominate. Each tries to stabilize a version of reality long enough to guide collective action. Consensus and fragility. The strange thing about consensus realities is their fragility. They feel unshakable until they crack. The Soviet Union collapsed when belief in its political consensus evaporated. Colonial empires dissolved once colonized peoples withdrew consent. Even religions can wane. In Europe, Christianity's hold as a shared consensus has declined sharply in the last century. When consensus dissolves, reality itself feels unstable. Berger and Luckman called this anomie, normlessness, the collapse of a shared map. People experience confusion, anxiety, and even existential vertigo when the social world no longer feels coherent. Personal reflection. My reality shifts. Looking at my own path, I can see how consensus realities shaped me and how they broke open. For much of my early life, I lived within realities I didn't question. The reality of diagnostic categories, the reality of certain social norms, the reality of materialist assumptions. But through stillness, meditation, and deep self-work, I saw cracks appear. My spiritual awakening, that silent moment where words fell away, was a rupture in consensus. It showed me that beneath all the labels, another kind of reality pulses, not dictated by systems, not confined to consensus, but direct, lived, wordless. When I began writing the Inversiverse, I was in some sense documenting the collapse of old consensuses, marketing, propaganda, indoctrination, and trying to chart alternatives. With my inner child was broken, I looked at the consensus of childhood labels and diagnoses, and how they silenced the human behind them. My projects became acts of resistance, small refusals to accept consensus as total. The gift and danger of consensus realities are not inherently bad. Without them, social life would collapse. Imagine trying to live in a society with no agreement on money, language, law, or morality. Chaos would ensue, but the danger is forgetting their constructed nature. When consensus is mistaken for eternal truth, it hardens into dogma. Law becomes tyranny. Religion becomes fundamentalism. Politics becomes propaganda. The challenge is balance, to participate in consensus when necessary, but also to step back and see its constructed edges. To remember that consensus can change, and that sometimes it must. Reflection prompt: ask yourself, what realities in your daily life are constructed by consensus? Money, work schedules, social media reputations, family roles? How many of these feel natural? And how many could, in fact, dissolve if enough people withdrew their agreement? Consensus gives stability, but it also asks conformity. Recognizing this tension is the beginning of freedom. Activity, reality check. Here's something to try. 1. Identify one social reality you live in daily. It might be money, marriage, nationality, or something else. 2. Imagine it dissolves overnight. If tomorrow the currency collapsed, or marriage ceased to exist, or your nationality was erased, what would shift in your daily life? 3. Journal your response. Would you feel fear, liberation, confusion? What anchors would remain if that consensus fell away? This activity is not about predicting collapse, but about loosening the grip of assumptions. It reminds us that many of the realities we live inside are sustained not by nature, but by collective agreement. Berger and Luckman taught us that the realities we inhabit are often scaffolds of agreement. Memes, media, law, and religion are all consensus engines. Fiat money, gender pronouns, and political slogans all show how fragile and powerful these constructions can be. Consensus realities allow us to live together, but they also bind us. They stabilize the social world, but they can also suffocate the imagination. Recognizing their constructed nature doesn't mean abandoning them. It means participating consciously, aware of both their power and their limits. Because the truth is, reality is not just what is, it is also what we agree it to be. Power and perception power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always appear in a uniform, a flag, or a badge. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in the words that shape the news we consume, in the rules of proper speech drilled into us at school, in the advertising slogans that slip into our subconscious. Language doesn't simply reflect power, it enacts it. Through the words that become common sense, through the phrases that circulate as truth, through the silences that keep other realities unspeakable. And perception, our fragile lens onto the world, is filtered through these linguistic grids long before we realize it. If in part 3 we explored reality as a shared consensus, here in part 4 we need to confront how consensus itself is manufactured, not neutrally, not fairly, but through struggles over language, meaning, and perception. This is the domain of hegemony, symbolic power, and propaganda. Hegemony. Gramsci's quiet power. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime, noticed something crucial. Ruling powers do not maintain control purely through violence or law. They win by shaping what feels normal. He called this cultural hegemony. It's not just about who holds the guns or the money. It's about who holds the words. Think of phrases like, "That's just the way things are." "It's common sense." "We've always done it this way." Those lines don't fall from the sky. They are the sediment of power, layered through education, religion, law, and media. They're the linguistic glue that keeps hierarchies intact without needing constant force. Take, for example, the workplace. The word professionalism carries an aura of neutrality. But whose standards define it? In many contexts, it means wearing certain clothes, using certain accents, and avoiding certain topics. Professional language often polices working class dialects, minority expressions, or emotional honesty. Through a single word, entire groups are marginalized, made to feel less legitimate. Ramsey would argue this isn't accidental. It's how ruling blocs reproduce themselves, not only through money or coercion, but by embedding their worldview in the very language we use. Symbolic power. Bourdieu and the weight of words. Pierre Bourdieu sharpened this insight with his idea of symbolic power. Power doesn't always operate through overt force. It works by making one way of speaking, one form of language, seem more valuable than others. Think about accents. A posh British accent carries authority in certain spaces. A regional dialect may be dismissed as uneducated. Yet both are equally rich, equally grammatical, equally expressive. The difference isn't in the language itself, but in the social value assigned to it. This is symbolic power at work. Language becomes a gatekeeper, to jobs, to education, to legitimacy. Who decides what counts as proper English or standard grammar? Not neutral linguists, but institutions of power, such as schools, governments, media, and corporations. Bourdieu argued that this creates a hierarchy of voices. Some ways of speaking are celebrated, others ridiculed. Some gain entry to the halls of power, others are silenced at the door. And most of us internalize this hierarchy without ever realizing it. Think of a child being corrected in class. Don't say ain't, say isn't. The correction isn't just grammatical, it's social training, a reminder of whose language counts. Over time, these corrections teach us not just how to speak, but how to perceive ourselves. Propaganda. Chomsky and the manufacture of consent. Noam Chomsky, in his propaganda model, co-written with Edward Herman, extended this logic to the media. The press, he argued, does not simply report reality. It filters it through what serves powerful interests. Ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, and ideology all operate as filters that shape the language of news. Think of war reporting. Soldiers from one's own nation are heroes or troops. Those on the other side are combatants or insurgents. Civilian deaths caused by our bombs are collateral damage. Civilian deaths caused by them are massacres. The language is not neutral. It frames perception, guiding the audience to see reality in one light rather than another. Or consider economic crises. When banks fail, the headlines often say they were bailed out. When citizens fail to pay debts, they are irresponsible. Same situation, inability to meet obligations, but entirely different linguistic framing, designed to protect institutions rather than individuals. Chomsky's point was stark. Propaganda is not something that happens only in dictatorships. It happens wherever powerful institutions control the flow of words, shaping perception without needing overt censorship. Discourse and truth. A light touch of Michel Foucault, for all his complexity, adds one more crucial insight. Power doesn't just repress, it produces. Every truth we know is produced within discourses, systems of language that define what can be said, what counts as knowledge, and who is allowed to speak. Take the category of mental illness. The words we use, disorder, diagnosis, treatment, are not just medical labels. They are part of a discourse that defines what counts as normal and abnormal. This doesn't mean mental suffering isn't real. It means the way we perceive it is inseparable from the language available to describe it. In my own work, My Inner Child Was Broken, I reflected on how diagnostic labels can fracture identity, turning moments of human struggle into lifelong pathologies. This is a Foucauldian point. The discourse creates the reality. It doesn't just describe illness. It produces the category of illness, shaping how people see themselves. Everyday examples of power in language. This may all sound abstract, but it's alive in our daily lives. Gender pronouns. Beyond the debates, pronouns reveal how language can affirm or deny identity. To misgender someone isn't just a slip, it's a denial of their linguistic self. Here, symbolic power and hegemony collide, and whose identity counts, whose language is validated. Corporate branding. Terms like sustainability, wellness, or innovation sound positive, but they're often deployed as linguistic shields, masking exploitation, greenwashing, or superficial change. The word becomes a tool of perception management. Political rhetoric. Words like freedom, terror, or safety are endlessly repeated, carrying a powerful emotional charge. But their meanings are slippery, strategically vague. They shape perception without offering clarity. Education. The insistence on standard English often hides linguistic inequality. A child punished for speaking in dialect learns not just grammar, but that their home language is wrong. Their perception of self narrows. Tying back to the Inversiverse, in the Inversiverse, I explored how systems of power manipulate perception through invisible means: suggestion, framing, conditioning. Part of that exploration is precisely what Gramsci, Bourdieu, and Chomsky were getting at. Language is not just description, it is designed. And design shapes perception. Once we see this, the world looks different. Every headline, every label, every correction becomes not just information, but a clue to where power is hiding. Reflection activity, a 24-hour linguistic audit. For one day, track the media and conversations you encounter. Don't judge, just observe. 1. Write down key phrases you hear or read. 2. Ask, what assumptions do they carry? 3. Whose interests do they serve? 4. What alternatives are silenced? Example, a news headline says markets react to jobs report. Notice how markets are personified, as if they are living beings with emotions, but workers are reduced to numbers. That single linguistic choice shifts perception. The economy is alive, people are data. At the end of the 24 hours, reflect. What reality was constructed through the words you consumed? What did it make visible? What did it hide? Language is power, not because it yells, but because it whispers. It tells us what is obvious, what is natural, and what is respectable. It frames our perception before we've even begun to think. Gramsci shows us how hegemony normalizes itself. Bourdieu shows us how accents and grammar distribute it. Chomsky shows us how the media manufactures it. Foucault reminds us how truth itself is produced through it. And in our daily lives it means this: perception is never innocent. What we see is already filtered through words chosen by someone, somewhere, with interests at play. If reality is consensus, as Part 3 argued, then consensus itself is the prize of power, and language is the battlefield where it is won or lost. Fractured realities. When I look around at the world today, what strikes me most is not that we disagree about what's true, but that we live in entirely different realities. The fracture isn't simply about opinion, it's linguistic. The words we use shape whole worlds, and when those words diverge, so do the realities they sustain. I've seen this fracture in my own life. I've written about it in the Inversiverse, where propaganda and marketing bend perception until people no longer question the spell. I've spoken about it in the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, where raw emotions like envy or rage are framed as shameful, and so we bury them rather than admit their presence. I've tracked it in my own nervous system, in the body knows, where I realize the body lives truths that language sometimes hides. And I've traced it all the way back through childhood, in My Inner Child Was Broken, where labels and silence fracture the self long before we even realize who we are. What all of these projects revealed to me is simple, though not easy. Reality is always filtered through language, and when language itself is contested, we no longer share the same world. Competing linguistic worlds, Nietzsche once wrote, there are no facts, only interpretations. At first that sounds nihilistic, but I've come to see it less as despair and more as a warning. Our access to reality is always mediated through language, and language is never neutral. Today, that mediation is accelerated by algorithms. Open two phones in the same cafe and you'll see two realities. My feed might be full of articles warning of environmental collapse. Yours might insist the crisis is exaggerated or even fabricated. My feed might frame a political figure as a savior. Yours might frame the same person as a villain. Both realities are constructed linguistically: headlines, memes, hashtags, soundbites. And because we rarely step outside our own feed, these linguistic worlds harden into lived realities. It's tempting to call this an information problem, as though the solution were just more objective facts. But facts don't live in a vacuum. They live in frames, and frames live in language. Tell me unemployment is 5%. That's a fact. Call it low, and it's reassuring. Call it rising, and it's alarming. Same number, different world. This is what Berger and Luckman meant when they wrote The Social Construction of Reality. Reality isn't just discovered, it's built, sustained, and defended by a collective agreement. And that agreement is linguistic at its core. Echo chambers and algorithmic selves. I notice how quickly online spaces become echo chambers. On one hand, they give comfort. People who get it, who share your terms, who validate your worldview. But on the other hand, they fracture reality further. Step outside the group, and suddenly the same event is named differently, valued, or even denied. Take a protest, for example. To one group, it's a fight for freedom. To another, it's a riot. The difference is not in the bodies on the street, but in the words we choose. Freedom fighters versus thugs. Civil disobedience versus public disorder. Those words don't just describe the event, they construct its reality. Algorithms intensify this fracture by feeding us the words we already agree with. It's not that the platforms set out to create different realities on purpose. It's that their design rewards engagement, and we engage most with what confirms us. Over time, this feedback loop doesn't just filter information, it filters reality itself. I've had to be conscious of this in my own work. Writing the Inversiverse, I saw how language is weaponized to frame not only political or cultural issues, but the very sense of what's possible. Indoctrination doesn't just tell you what to think, it teaches you what is thinkable. Everything else becomes invisible. The collapse of shared worlds. When realities fracture, dialogue collapses. If we don't share language, we don't share a world. I've felt this in conversations about my own diagnoses. Say autism, and one person might imagine Rain Man, another might think of Silicon Valley coders, another might dismiss it as a fad. Same word, different realities. And when I try to speak from my lived experience, I sometimes feel I'm not heard at all. I'm just translated back into their pre-existing frame. This isn't just about identity labels. It runs through politics, science, and religion. During the pandemic, I watched as one person's safety measure was another's tyranny. One person's public health was another's control. And both sides genuinely believed they were defending reality itself. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard called this hyperreality, a state where signs no longer point to reality, but to other signs, looping endlessly. At times I feel we live here now. Words don't describe the world. They describe each other, until the connection to lived reality is tenuous at best. My awakening into fracture. This is where my own awakening becomes relevant. For years I lived inside the realities handed to me. Diagnoses, scripts, media narratives. I took them as given. I thought that was the world. But when I embraced silence, when I did the inner work, meditation, reflection, writing, something shifted. I felt as though a portal opened in my mind. For the first time, I saw how fragile and constructed those realities were. It wasn't that I discovered the truth, once and for all. It was then that I realized there are always multiple truths, and that language can both illuminate and obscure them. From that moment, I became less interested in persuading others to share my reality, and more committed to offering perspectives that empower people to lead themselves. Some will dismiss my work, others will resonate. That's not the point. The point is that by naming the fractures, by seeing how realities are linguistically constructed, we begin to free ourselves from being trapped inside just one. Nietzsche and the shattered mirror Nietzsche's claim that there are no facts, only interpretations, has often been misunderstood as cynicism, but I read it as a kind of radical honesty. What he's saying is not that nothing is real, but that our access to reality is always mediated through perspective, and perspective is always shaped by language. To me, it feels like standing before a shattered mirror. Each shard reflects a piece of the world, none reflects the whole. If you cling to one shard, you mistake it for reality, but if you recognize the fragmentation, you can hold multiple shards together, imperfectly, and glimpse something larger. That's what I try to do in my work, not to declare one shard the truth, but to hold them in tension. To let my projects, the Inversiverse, the Unfiltered Human, the Body Knows, and My Inner Child Was Broken, and the Linguaverse, speak to each other, even when their voices conflict. Integration doesn't mean erasing the fracture. It means living with it consciously, practical activity. Compare two framings. Here's something you can try to see how fractured realities emerge. 1. Pick a single recent event. It could be political, cultural, or even something small in your community. 2. Find two different reports of it, ideally from sources with different biases. 3. Highlight the key words each uses. Are protesters activists or agitators? Is it a policy reform or rollback? Is a leader decisive or authoritarian? 4. Notice how those words construct two different realities around the same event. Then ask yourself, which one feels more persuasive and why? Is it the facts or the framing? Living in the fracture. The hardest part of fractured realities is that they leave us disoriented. Who do we trust? What do we believe? Where is the ground? I've felt this disorientation personally. Sometimes it's exhausting to hold multiple perspectives. Sometimes I long for a single solid truth. But every time I've tried to cling to one, I've felt the walls close in. The world shrinks. So instead, I practice staying with the fracture, recognizing that multiple realities coexist. That language builds each one, and that my task is not to escape the fracture, but to live in it consciously. In that sense, Nietzsche was right. Acts dissolve into interpretations. But maybe that's not the end of the truth. Maybe it's the beginning of wisdom, to see that truth is not singular, but plural, not fixed, but flowing. Fractured realities are not new. Human beings have always told competing stories, built competing worlds. What's new is the speed, scale, and visibility of the fracture in the digital age. The challenge is not to eliminate fracture, but to navigate it, to recognize the linguistic worlds we inhabit, the ones handed to us, the ones we choose, and the ones we build together. Because when we see the fracture clearly, we also see the possibility. If realities are built by language, they can be rebuilt. And that means the future is not just something that happens to us, it's something we speak into being. Activity compared two conflicting framings of the same event. Notice how the choice of words creates different realities. Beyond language, does reality exist without words? There are moments in life when words fail us, not just in the sense of being tongue-tied, but in the deeper sense that reality itself seems to spill beyond the edges of language. The edges of speech, I've experienced this in meditation, in grief, in awe, in moments where the world appeared larger than my vocabulary. No sentence could capture the clarity, the depth, or the immensity of those states. And in those moments, I ask myself a question that continues to haunt me. If language constructs so much of reality, what is reality without language? This is not an easy question, because the moment I try to answer it, I've already failed. I'm using words to describe a space beyond words. But still, I think it's worth exploring. Mystical traditions and wordless reality. Many traditions suggest that reality exists before language or perhaps is purer without it. Buddhism speaks of anatta, the no self, revealed in deep meditation when the inner chatter fades and awareness remains. Mystics across religions describe union with the divine as an encounter with silence, ineffability, or presence. Meister Eckhart wrote, "There is nothing so much like God as silence." In these traditions, words are seen as fingers pointing to the moon. Useful, but not the moon itself. Language is a guide, but reality is what remains when the guide steps aside. Scientific perspectives on the wordless science, too, offers glimpses of this. Neuroscience has mapped how language networks in the brain interact with perception. Under certain conditions, meditation, trauma, psychedelics, and the language centers quiet down. When this happens, people often describe experiences of timelessness, unity, or vastness. The default mode network, the system in the brain associated with self-narration and inner chatter, tends to go quiet during deep meditative states or psychedelic journeys. And when it does, a different kind of awareness emerges, not framed by words, not narrated as me, but vivid nonetheless. This suggests that reality, at least experientially, does not depend on language. Perception continues without it. In fact, sometimes it becomes sharper when words fall silent. Dreams and psychedelics. Reality without grammar, consider dreams. In dreams, meaning flows without grammar. You may fly, shift bodies, encounter impossible landscapes. The dream feels real while you are in it, even though it often defies the logic of language. Only when you wake and try to describe it do you feel the awkward mismatch between dream logic and words. Psychedelics create similar states. Many people report experiences that feel more real than waking life, yet utterly ineffable. They struggle to explain, using phrases like beyond language, impossible to describe, or you had to be there. Again, reality is there, vivid, undeniable, but language lags. The silence I encountered. For me, the most profound encounter with this came during meditation. I wasn't chasing insight. I was sitting, breathing, allowing silence to unfold. Then, something shifted. My awareness expanded, as if I were suddenly looking through a wider lens. The usual stream of thought and self-narration dropped away, and yet I wasn't lost. If anything, I felt more present, more real than in ordinary language-bound states. I didn't have sentences at that moment. I didn't even have the word self. What I had was a direct experience of being, of clarity, of connection. Later, I could describe it, but in the moment, there were no words. That experience left me with a paradox. Language builds the self, yes, but silence revealed something just as true, perhaps truer. Assul, Merleau-Ponty, and phenomenology philosophers in the phenomenological tradition grappled with this paradox. Edmund Husserl argued that before language, there is the raw life world, the world as it appears directly in lived experience. Language then organizes, describes, and interprets it, but the experience itself exists first. Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized the body's role. He described perception not as something filtered through language, but as embodied, the way the hand knows the texture of wood, the eyes know depth, the skin knows warmth, words come after. Reality is encountered first through sensation. This philosophical lineage points to the same idea. Language is not the origin of reality, it is a frame. Sometimes helpful, sometimes distorting. The paradox of naming and silence. There's a paradox here. On the one hand, language helps us grasp reality. To name an experience is to integrate it, to make it shareable, to stitch it into memory. Without words, experiences risk slipping away. On the other hand, language can also diminish. To reduce all grief or awakening into a sentence often feels like betrayal. The words are too small for the immensity of the experience. So we live in tension. We need language to communicate reality, but we also need silence to experience it fully. When silence reveals more than words, I've noticed this in conversation too. There are moments when a pause, a look, or shared silence communicates more truth than any string of sentences could. In grief, words often feel hollow. Presence speaks louder. In love, sometimes a gaze is enough. The sentence "I love you" feels like a repetition of something already known. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is another form of it, a language beyond words. Activity. Wordless observation 1. Find a quiet space. Set a timer for 5 minutes. 2. Sit in silence. Notice your surroundings without naming them. Don't think tree, car, bird. Just notice colors, movements, sounds, sensations. 3. When the timer ends, journal what the experience was like. Did reality feel different without words? Sharper, softer, more immediate? This practice isn't about rejecting language. It's about noticing how much of reality exists outside it, and how often we overlook it because we're too busy narrating. Why this matters for the linguistic self. Why does all this matter in the context of language and reality? Because it shows that while language is powerful, it is not total. Reality is not built only from words. Words shape, frame, and sustain worlds, yes. But there is also a stratum of reality that resists them. Silence, sensation, presence, awe. If I only live in language, I risk mistaking the map for the territory. I risk confusing my labels with life itself. But if I allow myself to step into silence, even briefly, I reconnect with a dimension of being that is not mediated by words. So does reality exist without words? My answer is yes, and not just abstractly, but experientially. I've tasted it in meditation, in silence, in awe, in trauma, in love. I've seen how reality remains vivid, undeniable, even when the narration stops. But I've also seen how language lets me share those realities, how it allows me to build bridges with others. Without words, the experience is private. With words, it becomes communal. And so I hold the paradox. Reality is larger than language, but language is what lets us touch each other's realities. That, to me, is the work of the linguistic self, to know when to speak and when to fall silent. Words as builders and breakers of worlds. As we close this journey into language and reality, I want to pause and hold the weight of what we've uncovered. Throughout this episode, we have seen how reality is not a neutral backdrop, but a tapestry woven from words, agreements, and shared stories. Berger and Luckman called this the social construction of reality, and their insight is still radical. The world we live in is not merely discovered, it is continually created. Currency only works because we collectively say it does. Laws only bind because we agree to let them. Even concepts as intimate as gender or health, as global as nationhood or climate change, are bound together by words, debated, negotiated, translated, and stabilized in language. This makes language at once liberating and dangerous. Words create possibilities, but they also impose boundaries. They invite solidarity, and they invite division. They open doors into new futures, and they nail us to old categories. For me, this is not abstract. At one time, my reality was narrower, weighed down by inherited scripts, by diagnostic labels, by systems of language that defined me before I had defined myself. When silence finally entered, when I sat still enough in meditation to experience what felt like a portal opening inside my own mind, I realized that reality is not fixed, it shifts. The words I had once taken as truths began to dissolve, and in their place came perspectives I had never considered. Knowledge deepened, perception widened, and what was once unexplained became clear. That moment showed me something simple but profound. Reality bends to the words we carry, but it is never exhausted by them. And that is where we end this arc of reflection, on the tension between the constructed and the ineffable, the spoken and the silent. A mirror for you, so I want to turn this outward. Think for a moment about the realities you inhabit. Which ones feel solid, obvious, unquestionable? Money, borders, diagnosis, national identity? And now ask, what if they are not natural laws, but linguistic agreements? What happens when you remember that words hold them together? Reality does not dissolve into nothingness when we see this. It becomes negotiable, it becomes alive, it becomes something we can shape, not just something we endure. But the reverse is also true. When we forget this, when we treat words as immovable truths rather than human constructions, we risk being shaped by forces we don't even see. We risk mistaking propaganda for truth, ideology for fact, narrative for nature. This is why reflection matters. This is why stepping back from language, even briefly, matters. To see where words open possibilities and where they trap us in illusions. Take a quiet moment with this. Recall a time when language expanded your reality, when hearing or learning a new word, concept, or story suddenly made the world feel larger. Then recall a time when language distorted your reality, when a label, a headline, or a phrase narrowed you, trapped you, or made the world feel smaller. What do these two memories reveal about the power of words in your life? Where have words acted as wings? Where have they acted as cages? Activity, the language reality map. Here is a practice you can carry into your week. 1. Take a blank sheet of paper. 2. Write down 10 words that feel central to your worldview. These could be concepts like freedom, family, science, faith, resilience, trauma, justice, art, love, and survival. 3. Next to each word, ask 2 questions. What realities does this word open for me? What possibilities, connections, meanings? What realities does this word close for me? What limits, assumptions, exclusions? 4. Step back and look at your map. Which words are expansive? Which are restrictive? Which ones feel inherited? And which feel chosen? This exercise isn't about changing your words immediately. It's about awareness. To see how language is not just something you use, but something that quietly builds the reality you walk inside every day. Words as veils and windows. And so episode 14, Language and Reality, comes to a close. We've travelled from consensus to conflict, from power to silence, from fractured worlds to transcendent glimpses beyond words. Along the way, we've seen that reality is not one thing, but many overlapping, colliding, constructed and reconstructed through the words we share and the words we resist. Words are veils and they are windows. They cover the world, sometimes distorting what lies beneath. But they also open us onto new vistas, revealing depths we had not seen before. To live consciously with language is to learn when to look through the window and when to lift the veil. And this leads us to where we're heading next. Episode 15 will take us into a new terrain, the future of the spell. If words build reality, then what happens when those words are automated, predicted, and programmed by algorithms? When language itself becomes code, and code becomes the medium of thought? What kind of spells will we find ourselves under then? That is where we'll go next. Into the algorithmic mind, into predictive systems, into the future of language as spellwork. Until then, I want to leave you with this reminder. Reality is not something you simply live inside. It is something you help create word by word, silence by silence. Until next time, stay curious, stay awake to your own language, and remember, the worlds you speak are the worlds you inhabit. You've been listening to the Linguaverse. I'm James Miller.